If you ever feel like something is wrong, don't wait for proof, walk away. That was what my mother used to say, and standing under the golden glow of the Astoria Grand Ballroom, balancing a tray of wine glasses worth more than my weekly paycheck, I realized too late that instinct doesn't always come with an exit. The chandeliers above me shimmered like frozen fire, scattering light across marble floors polished so perfectly they reflected the illusion of a world I didn't belong to. A world where men wore watches that cost more than my student loans and women spoke in quiet tones that carried more power than raised voices ever could. And I was just Lena Carter, 26, pulling an $18 an hour shift in a borrowed uniform that didn't quite fit, trying not to spill anything or draw attention. Because attention in a place like this wasn't something you wanted unless you were born into it. The tray felt heavier than it should have, 6 glasses of deep red Bordeaux trembling slightly as I moved through the crowd, weaving between conversations about real estate, mergers, and charity donations that sounded generous until you realized they were tax strategies dressed up as kindness, and I kept my eyes forward like I'd been trained. Don't linger, don't listen, don't exist more than necessary, except something pulled at me, subtle at first, like a thread catching on fabric, a detail that didn't fit, and I slowed just enough to notice the glass. It was almost identical to the others, same crystal, same pour, same rich color catching the light, but there was something off, something darker at the rim, something that made my stomach tighten before my brain could explain it, and I saw the man who had touched it, just a second too long, adjusting it on the tray before stepping back into the crowd like he had never been there at all, and maybe I should have ignored it, maybe I should have kept walking like every other server in this room, trained to mind their business, but my hand tightened around the edge of the tray, and that voice in my head, the one I'd learned to trust the hard way, whispered one word: wrong. I didn't know what it was, didn't know why, but I knew enough to understand that something was about to happen, and the only problem was I didn't know to who until I saw him. Adrian Volkov didn't need an introduction. Not in this room, not in this city. His presence moved through the crowd like a quiet shift in gravity. People didn't stare, they adjusted, they made space without realizing they were doing it, and I'd seen his face before, in articles that never quite said what he did but always implied it. A man who owned too much to be questioned and controlled too much to be ignored, and somehow my feet carried me closer to him before I had fully decided to move, each step louder in my head than it could possibly be on marble, my pulse sinking with the distant hum of the string quartet as if time itself had slowed to watch what I was about to do. I didn't stop to think, because thinking would have stopped me, and stopping would have meant doing nothing, and doing nothing felt worse than whatever this was. So as I passed him, just another invisible server in a sea of black and white uniforms, I slipped the folded napkin into his hand like it weighed nothing at all, like it wasn't the only thing standing between him and whatever I had just felt in my bones, and I kept walking, because that's what you do. You don't wait, you don't look back, you disappear before anyone notices, except I didn't get more than 2 steps before his fingers closed around my wrist. Not rough, not sudden, just certain, like he had always intended to stop me. Like this moment had already happened somewhere before I ever made the choice, and the world didn't stop, the music didn't falter, conversations continued like nothing had changed, but everything had, because I could feel it in the way the air shifted, in the way my breath caught halfway in my chest, and when I turned, slowly, because anything faster felt like a mistake. His eyes were already on me, calm, unreadable, and far too focused for someone who had just been handed a warning note, and he didn't look at the napkin first, didn't even glance down. He looked at me like I was the answer, not the message, and that was when I realized I hadn't just interrupted something. I had stepped directly into it. His grip did not tighten, but it did not loosen either. And somehow that made it worse, because there was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty, just quiet control, like he had already decided how this would go and was simply waiting for me to catch up. And I became painfully aware of everything at once, the weight of the tray still balanced in my other hand, the low hum of conversation continuing around us, the distant sound of a violin sliding into a softer note, and the way no one was looking directly at us even though I knew they noticed, because people like him did not get approached without consequence, and people like me were not supposed to exist long enough to be remembered. You should let go, I said, keeping my voice low, steady in a way that surprised even me, because panic would have been easier, panic would have been honest, but something about his stillness forced me into control I did not feel, and for a second I thought he might actually listen, but instead his thumb shifted slightly against my wrist, not pressing, just adjusting, like he was confirming I was real, and then he unfolded the napkin with his free hand, slow, deliberate, his eyes never leaving mine even as he read the words I had written in a rush that now felt like a lifetime ago. There was no visible reaction, no flicker of surprise, no tightening of his jaw, nothing that said he had just been warned about something potentially life-threatening, and that was the moment my confidence cracked, because I had expected something, anything, a question, a step back, a signal to someone, but instead he simply looked at me like the note had confirmed something he already suspected, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low enough that it did not carry beyond us, but sharp, enough that it cut through every other sound in the room. "Who told you?" he said, not as a question but as a fact waiting to be acknowledged, and I shook my head immediately, too quickly. I knew that even as I did it, but there was no time to correct it, no time to rebuild the lie into something believable, because he was already watching every detail, every breath, every blink like it mattered. "No one," I said, forcing the words out evenly. "I just saw something that did not look right." And I hated how thin it sounded the second it left my mouth. How incomplete, how insufficient against someone who clearly lived in a world where incomplete answers were not tolerated. He glanced down at the tray then, finally, his eyes flicking over the glasses with a precision that made my chest tighten, like he could see the same thing I had seen without needing it explained, and for a moment I thought he might release me, might dismiss it, might decide I was not worth the attention, but instead he stepped slightly closer, just enough that I could feel the shift in space between us, not touching beyond his hand on my wrist, but close enough that the air felt different, heavier, like stepping into a room where something important had already happened and you were the last to know. "You walked straight to me," he said quietly, and that was not a question either. "You did not hesitate, you did not warn anyone else, you chose me." And there it was, the part one had not thought through, the part that made this more than just a warning, because he was right. I had chosen him without knowing why, without understanding what that choice would mean, and now I could feel it settling around me like something irreversible. "I did not know who else," I said, and that at least was true, or true enough to stand on, but he did not respond to that, did not acknowledge it, just studied me for another long second that stretched far beyond its actual length, and then, somewhere behind us, a glass shattered. It was not loud enough to stop the room, not immediately, just a sharp sound that cut through the music, followed by a murmur that grew too fast, voices overlapping, chairs shifting, and I did not need to turn to know what had happened. I felt it in the way his gaze changed, not toward the sound, not toward the man who had just collapsed somewhere in the crowd, but back to me, sharper now, more focused, like the event itself had confirmed the only thing he cared about. "Stay," he said, and this time it was unmistakably a command. Not raised, not forced, just absolute. And his hand finally released my wrist only to move to the tray, lifting one of the untouched glasses and setting it aside with careful precision before placing the entire tray onto a passing server station without looking, like he trusted the world to rearrange itself around him. And then his hand returned, not gripping this time, but guiding, just enough pressure at my arm to turn me away from the chaos unfolding behind us, away from the questions that would follow, away from the man who had taken the drink meant for someone else. And as we moved toward a quieter corner of the ballroom, I realized with a clarity that settled deep in my chest that whatever I had tried to prevent had already happened, and whatever came next was no longer something I could walk away from. The moment we stepped away from the center of the ballroom, the sound changed, not quieter exactly, but more distant, like the chaos unfolding behind us had been sealed off by invisible glass, and I could still hear fragments of it. A woman asking if someone had called 911. A man insisting it was probably just a medical episode, the clink of glass being cleared too quickly, but none of it touched us where Adrian had positioned me, in a narrow stretch between a marble column and a velvet curtain where the light softened and the world narrowed to just him and the space I no longer controlled. I pulled my arm back instinctively, not running, not even stepping away, just enough to reclaim something that felt like mine, and this time he let me, which somehow felt more intentional than holding me in the first place, because it meant he was choosing not to restrain me rather than losing the ability to, and that distinction settled into my chest in a way I could not ignore. "You knew it would happen," he said, and there was no accusation in his tone, no raised voice, just a quiet alignment of facts that made denial feel almost pointless. But I forced it anyway because admitting anything now felt like stepping into something I could not step out of. "I did not know," I said, keeping my voice even, focusing on each word like it mattered. "I just saw something wrong and I warned you." And I could hear how it sounded, How simple it was compared to everything that had just unfolded, and for a second I wondered if he would dismiss me entirely, if this would end with him deciding I was not worth the time, but instead he watched me more closely, like the simplicity itself was the problem. "You chose the exact moment," he said, his voice lower now, closer, though he had not moved. "You approached the right person, and you walked away without waiting to see if I listened." And he paused just long enough for the weight of that to settle. "People who guess do not do that." I swallowed, feeling the edge of something sharp building under my ribs. Not fear exactly, but pressure. Like every option was narrowing at once, and before I could respond, one of his men appeared at the edge of the curtain, speaking quietly, too low for me to hear, but I saw the slight shift in Adrian's expression. Not surprise, not concern, just confirmation, and that was worse, because it meant everything was unfolding exactly as expected. "The man who collapsed," Adrian said, turning his attention back to me without looking at his guard again. "He was not the target." And the statement landed between us like something heavy, because I already knew that. I had known it the second I saw the wrong glass, but hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way I could not pretend away. "I do not know anything about that," I said quickly, too quickly, and this time I heard it, the crack in my own voice that I had been trying to hide, and his eyes sharpened slightly, not in anger, but in focus, like he had just found the exact thread to pull. "You are careful with your words," he said, and there was something almost thoughtful in it, like he was evaluating a puzzle rather than confronting a threat. "But you are not careful with your reactions." And I felt my chest tighten because he was right, because no matter how controlled I tried to be, my body had already betrayed me in ways I could not take back. Behind us, the movement in the ballroom shifted again, more controlled now, less panic, more containment, and I realized that whatever had happened was already being managed, already being folded into whatever system men like him used to keep things quiet, and that realization hit harder than anything else because it meant this was not an interruption, it was part of a pattern, something that had happened before and would happen again, and somehow I had stepped directly into it. "Look at me," Adrian said, and I realized I had dropped my gaze without meaning to, focusing on the floor, on the reflection of light in polished marble, on anything that was not him, and when I looked back up, his expression had not changed, still calm, still unreadable, but there was something underneath it now, something sharper, something that felt like a decision forming. "You are either very unlucky," he continued, "or very involved." And the space between those two options felt smaller than it should have, like either way led to the same place, and I felt the truth of that settle in my chest before I could stop it, because there was no version of this where I walked away clean. I took a slow breath, steadying myself the only way I knew how, and met his gaze fully this time, because if this was already out of my control, then the only thing left was how I stood in it. "If I was involved," I said quietly, "you would not be standing here asking questions." And for the first time something shifted in his expression, not a smile, not approval, just the smallest change, like I had finally said something that mattered, and that was when I understood that this was not about the drink anymore. Not about the man who had collapsed or the chaos still echoing behind us. This was about me, about what I knew, what I had done, and what I was about to become whether I wanted it or not. The shift in his expression was small, almost unnoticeable, but it changed everything, because it meant I had crossed some invisible threshold, said something that placed me somewhere different in his mind, not cleared, not trusted, but no longer dismissed, and that realization settled into me with a quiet weight that made it harder to breathe evenly. The noise from the ballroom had steadied into something controlled now, the kind of calm that did not come from resolution but from management, and I could feel the presence of his people without seeing them, subtle movements at the edges, conversations that stopped when he passed, the quiet authority of a system already in motion, and I understood then that whatever had happened tonight was already being contained in ways I could not see or influence. Adrian took a step back, just enough to widen the space between us, and for a second I thought that meant I was being released, that whatever this was had reached its end, but instead he lifted his hand slightly, not touching me, just indicating a direction behind me, toward a side corridor that led away from the ballroom, away from the light and the music and the illusion of normalcy. "We are not done," he said, his voice even, controlled, but final in a way that left no room for argument, and I felt that same tightening in my chest again, not panic, not yet, but something close, something that understood this was the moment where walking away was no longer an option I could choose on my own. I hesitated for half a second, just enough to feel it, the instinct to step back, to disappear into the crowd, to pretend none of this had happened. But the thought dissolved as quickly as it came, because I knew it would not work, not here, not with him, not after everything that had already unfolded. And so I turned, moving in the direction he had indicated, aware of him just behind me, not close enough to touch, but close enough that I could feel the certainty of his presence without needing to look. The corridor was quieter, the sound of the gala fading into a distant murmur, replaced by the soft echo of footsteps on polished stone, and the low hum of ventilation that seemed too loud in the absence of everything else. And for the first time since this started, I became aware of my own breathing again, shallow, controlled, like I was trying not to disturb something fragile in the air. "You are not afraid," he said from behind me, not a question, and I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it was so completely wrong and so strangely accurate at the same time. Because I was afraid, I could feel it in the tightness of my chest and the way my hands wanted to shake. But it was not the kind of fear that made you run. It was the kind that made you stay, that made you pay attention, that made you understand that every move mattered more than usual. "I am careful," I said instead, choosing the word deliberately, and there was a pause behind me, a fraction of a second where I felt his attention sharpen again, like that answer had shifted something, added a new layer to whatever calculation he was building. "Careful people do not interfere," he replied, and there was something almost quiet in that, not judgment, not accusation, just observation, and I felt the truth of it press against me, because he was right. Careful people looked away, careful people stayed in their place, careful people did not slip notes into the hands of men like him in the middle of a room full of power and expectation. And yet here I was, standing in a hallway I was never meant to enter, being led further away from anything familiar. We reached a door at the end of the corridor, dark wood, polished to a mirror finish, and one of his men was already there, stepping aside without being asked, opening it with a quiet efficiency that spoke of practice, not urgency, and Adrian gestured for me to go in first, not forcing, not guiding, just indicating, and that somehow made it harder to refuse, because it meant the choice still felt like mine even when it was not. I stepped inside, the room beyond dimmer, quieter, the air cooler, and before I could fully take it in, before I could decide what to say or how to stand or whether there was any version of this that ended with me walking out the same person, the door closed softly behind us, sealing out the last trace of the ballroom, and for the first time since I had written that note, I understood that whatever this was, it was only just beginning. The room was quieter than it should have been, not silent but insulated, like the walls had been designed to keep things in as much as they kept things out. And for a moment I just stood there, letting my eyes adjust to the softer lighting, the kind that did not glare or demand attention but revealed details slowly, deliberately, a private space tucked inside a public world, and I could feel him behind me, not moving, not speaking, just present in a way that made the air feel measured. I took a step forward, more out of instinct than instruction, and noticed the table near the center of the room, dark wood, polished, untouched, a single glass of water set neatly beside a leather folder, everything arranged with intention, and that was when it hit me. This was not a place people stumbled into. This was a place decisions were made. "Turn around," Adrian said, and I did, because there was something in his tone that did not ask for compliance but expected it, and when I faced him again, he was watching me with the same quiet focus, only now there was no distraction, no crowd, no movement to dilute it, just him and whatever conclusion he was building piece by piece. "You saw something wrong," he repeated, echoing my earlier words, but this time they sounded different, like he was testing them against everything else he had observed, and I nodded once, keeping my posture steady even as I felt the pressure of the moment settling deeper. "Yes," I said, and for a second that felt like enough, like the truth in its simplest form could hold. But then he took a step closer, not enough to invade my space, just enough to shift the balance again, and I realized he was not interested in what I said. He was interested in how I said it, how I held it, how it fit into everything else. "What did you see?" he asked, and this time it was a question, but not one I could answer carelessly, because I could feel the weight behind it, the expectation that whatever I said next would either align with what he already believed or expose me completely. I hesitated just for a fraction of a second, and in that hesitation I saw it, the way his gaze sharpened slightly, the way he registered the pause like it mattered more than any word I could choose, and I understood then that this was no longer about the event in the ballroom, this was about me, about what I knew and how I knew it. "The glass," I said finally, keeping my voice level. "One of them was different, the color at the rim, the way it was handled. and I watched him as I spoke, watched for any reaction. Any sign that I had said too much or not enough, but his expression remained controlled, unreadable, which somehow made it worse, because it meant I had not surprised him. "And you concluded it was dangerous," he said, and again it was not quite a question, more like he was guiding me towards something specific, something he expected me to reach, and I nodded again, feeling the edge of something tightening in my chest, because this was the point where the simple explanation stopped being enough. "I did not conclude," I said carefully. "I reacted." And for the first time since we entered the room, there was a shift, subtle but real, a slight tilt of his head, a pause that stretched just long enough to register as interest rather than dismissal. "Reaction requires pattern recognition," he said, and there was something almost quiet in his tone now, like he was no longer testing me, but confirming something he had already suspected. "People do not recognize patterns like that without exposure." And the words settled between us with a weight that made my pulse quicken, because this was it, the moment where the line between what I could explain and what I could not became impossible to maintain. I opened my mouth to respond, to deflect, to redirect, but nothing came out immediately, and in that silence, everything I had been holding back felt suddenly visible, like the absence of an answer was louder than any lie I could have constructed. He watched me for another second, then another, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but sharper, more certain. "You knew the timing," he said. "You knew the method, and you knew who to approach." And he took one final step closer, close enough now that I could feel the presence of him without needing to move, without needing to guess. "That is not instinct," he finished, his gaze steady, unwavering. "That is knowledge." And there it was, placed clearly between us, not as an accusation, not as a threat, but as a fact, and in that moment I understood that whatever version of myself I had been trying to present, whatever careful balance I had been maintaining, it had already been seen through, already been measured, and the only question left was what I would do with that truth now that it had been spoken out loud. The word knowledge did not echo in the room, but it stayed, hanging between us, with a weight that made it impossible to ignore, and for the first time since I had walked into that ballroom, I felt something shift inside me, not fear, not panic, but the quiet realization that there was no version of this conversation where I could stay on the surface and walk away untouched. I let out a slow breath, not dramatic, not revealing, just enough to steady the rhythm of my thoughts, because whatever I said next mattered more than anything I had said before, and I could feel that he knew it too. "You are assuming too much," I said, choosing each word carefully, not rushing, not reacting, because reacting was what had brought me here in the first place, and I was not going to make that mistake again. His expression did not change, but his eyes held steady, focused in a way that made it clear he was not listening for the words alone. He was listening for what sat behind them. "No," he replied quietly. "I am removing what does not fit." And there was something precise in that, something controlled, like he was not building a theory but refining one, cutting away anything unnecessary until only the truth remained. I felt my chest tighten slightly at that, not because I did not expect it, but because hearing it out loud made it harder to pretend this was still something I could steer. I turned my gaze briefly to the table, to the glass of water that had not been touched, to the folder that remained closed, and for a moment I focused on those details instead of him, grounding myself in something neutral, something that did not look back at me with expectation. "I studied pre-med," I said finally, letting the explanation come in a way that sounded natural, practiced but not rehearsed, 2 years at New York University before I had to leave. And that part was true, or at least close enough to truth to hold weight, and I let it sit there for a second, giving it space to breathe, to feel complete. "You learn things," I continued, "about reactions, about what does not belong." And I kept my tone steady, not defensive, not evasive, just factual, because facts were easier to stand on than explanations. He watched me the entire time, and when I finished, there was a pause, not long, but deliberate, like he was placing my words into the structure he had already built and seeing where they fit. "And that explains the glass," he said, and for a second I thought I had done it, thought I had found a version of the truth that would hold under his scrutiny, but then he continued, "But it does not explain the timing." And the quiet certainty in that sentence landed harder than anything before it, because it meant he had already accepted part of what I said and rejected the rest without hesitation. I felt my pulse pick up slightly, just enough to remind me that this was not a conversation I could win by layering half-truths. And for the first time, I understood that the more I tried to simplify this, the more it would expose the parts one was trying to hide. You walked directly to me, he went on, his voice still calm, still measured. Not to security, not to the host, not to anyone else in the room. And he took a slow step to the side, not closer, not farther, just enough to shift the angle between us, forcing me to turn slightly to keep facing him, to stay engaged whether I wanted to or not. That is not instinct, he repeated, softer now, but no less certain. That is selection. And the words settled into me with a clarity that made it harder to breathe evenly, because he was right. I had chosen him, not randomly, not impulsively, but with a certainty I had not allowed myself to examine until now. I opened my mouth to respond, to push back, to reshape the narrative one more time. But the words felt thinner now, less convincing even to me, and for a second I said nothing, letting the silence stretch just enough to acknowledge that something had shifted. His gaze did not leave mine, but there was a subtle change in it now, not suspicion, not accusation, something closer to recognition, like he was no longer trying to figure out if I knew something, but how much I knew and why. You prepared for this, he said finally, and there was no question in it, no room left for denial that would matter. The only thing I do not know is why, and that was the first time he had asked something that felt real, not a test, not a trap, but a genuine gap in his understanding, and I felt it, the weight of that question settling deeper than everything else, because it was the one thing I could not answer without unraveling everything that had brought me here, everything I had tried to keep contained, and for the first time since this started, I hesitated not because I did not know what to say, but because I knew exactly what would happen if I said it. The silence stretched longer this time, not empty but filled with something heavier, something that pressed against my ribs and made it harder to breathe without thinking about it. And I knew he felt it too, not because he reacted, but because he did not, because he stood there with the same controlled stillness that had defined him from the beginning, waiting without urgency, without pressure, like time itself worked differently for him. I could have answered, I could have said something simple, something clean, something that kept the edges of the truth buried where they belonged, but the problem was he was no longer asking the kind of question that allowed for simple answers, and I could feel that narrowing, that tightening of space where every word had weight and every silence said more than I wanted it to. Because someone was going to die, I said finally, and the moment the words left my mouth I knew they were not enough. Not for him, not for what he had already seen, but they were the closest thing to truth I could offer without stepping too far, and I held his gaze as I said it, because looking away now would only confirm everything he already suspected. His expression did not change, but there was a shift, subtle, almost imperceptible, like he had just moved one piece into place in a pattern only he could see. That explains the warning, he said, his voice calm, measured. It does not explain the target. And there it was again, that precision, that refusal to accept anything that did not align perfectly, and I felt the pressure build in my chest because he was right, because everything I said circled around the same problem, the same truth I was trying not to say out loud. Before I could respond, there was a knock at the door, soft, but deliberate, and for the first time since we entered the room, Adrian's attention shifted away from me, just slightly, just enough to acknowledge it. "Come in," he said, and the door opened immediately. One of his men stepping inside, posture straight, expression neutral, the kind of controlled presence I was starting to recognize as part of his world. He spoke quietly, too low for me to catch every word, but I heard enough, heard the fragments that mattered. Service corridor, interference, possible witness, and something in my chest tightened again, not from fear this time, but from recognition, because I understood what those words meant before they finished being said. Adrian did not react outwardly, did not interrupt, did not question, he just listened, and when the man finished, he gave a single nod, subtle, decisive, and the man stepped back, closing the door behind him as smoothly as he had entered, leaving us alone again in a room that suddenly felt smaller than before. Adrian turned his attention back to me, and this time there was no pause, no evaluation, just a quiet certainty that had replaced whatever uncertainty had existed before. "You need to leave," he said, and the words caught me off guard, not because of what they meant, but because of how they were delivered, not as a dismissal, not as a release, but as a calculation, like he was moving me out of a space where something else was about to happen. "I can leave on my own," I said quickly, instinctively, and for a second I thought that might be enough, that this was the moment where I could step back into the world I understood, where this would end as abruptly as it had begun. But he shook his head once, small, controlled, and that single movement told me more than anything else he had said. "No," he replied, and there was no edge to it, no threat, just certainty. "You cannot." And the weight of that settled into me immediately, because it meant this was no longer about what I had done. It was about what had been set in motion because of it. I felt my pulse quicken slightly, not in panic, but in awareness, because I understood now that whatever had been planned for that glass had not simply failed. It had shifted, it had adapted, and somehow I had become part of that shift. "What does that mean?" I asked, and this time the question came out before I could stop it, because I needed to understand where this was going, needed to know what I had stepped into, and for the first time he did not answer immediately. He studied me for a second longer, like he was deciding how much to say, how much I needed to know versus how much he was willing to reveal. And then he spoke, his voice lower now, quieter, but more direct than anything before. "It means," he said, "that whoever set this in motion knows something went wrong." And he took a small step closer, not enough to crowd me, but enough to anchor the moment, to make sure I did not miss what came next. "And you are the only variable they did not account for." And the words settled into me with a clarity that made everything else fade, because in that instant, I understood that this was no longer about what I had prevented. It was about what I had become in the process, something visible, something unexpected, something that did not fit into a plan that was still unfolding somewhere beyond this room. The words did not feel real at first, like they belonged to a different version of the night, one where I had stayed quiet, walked past, done exactly what I was supposed to do and nothing more. But they were real, and they settled into me with a slow, undeniable weight that made everything else fall into place in a way I had not wanted to see before. A variable. Not a person, not a witness, not even a mistake, just a variable. Something unaccounted for in a plan that was still moving forward somewhere beyond this room. And the realization tightened something in my chest that I could not ignore. "Then I leave now," I said, the words coming faster than before, not rushed, but driven by a clarity I had not felt until this moment. Because if I was the variable, then removing myself should restore whatever balance had been disrupted, should close the gap that had been opened. Adrian's gaze did not shift, did not soften, but there was something in it now that felt different, something that suggested he had already considered that option and dismissed it before. I had even spoken. "You leaving changes nothing," he said, calm, certain, and the way he said it made it clear this was not an opinion, it was a conclusion. "They already know the plan failed," he continued, his voice steady, controlled, "and they will want to know why." The room felt smaller again, not physically, but in the way the air seemed to press closer, the walls holding in more than just sound, and I could feel the edges of my control tightening as the implications settled in. "I did not do anything," I said, quieter now, not defensive, just stating what I wanted to believe, what I needed to hold on to if I was going to keep this from unraveling completely. "You changed the outcome," he replied, and there was no emphasis in his tone, no weight added to the words, but they landed heavier than anything else he had said, because they were true in a way I could not deny. I looked down for a second, not to avoid him, but to ground myself, to find something stable in a moment that was shifting too fast, and my eyes landed on my hands, steady now, no tremor, no visible sign of what I was feeling, and that steadiness felt strange, almost disconnected from everything happening around me. "What happens next?" I asked, and this time the question was not instinctive, it was deliberate, because if I was already part of this, then I needed to understand the direction it was moving in, needed to know what came after the moment I had already disrupted. Adrian did not answer immediately, and in that pause I could see it, the calculation, the way he was measuring not just the situation, but me, what I knew, what I might do, how I fit into something larger than this room, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter but more direct than before. "They will try to identify the point of failure," he said, "and they will start with proximity." And he stepped slightly to the side, his movement subtle but intentional, shifting the angle between us again, forcing me to turn, to stay aligned with him, to remain engaged whether I wanted to or not. "You were close," he continued, "closer than anyone else who was not meant to be." And the words settled into me with a clarity that made it impossible to look away, because he was right. I had been in the exact place I should not have been, at the exact moment something went wrong. "That does not mean they will find me," I said, but even as I spoke, I could hear the uncertainty in my own voice, could feel the gap between what I wanted to believe and what was actually possible. It means they will try, he corrected, and there was something in his tone now that felt less like analysis and more like certainty, like he had seen this pattern before, understood it in a way I did not, and that understanding carried a weight I could not ignore. He moved then, not toward the door, not away from me, but toward the table, picking up the glass of water and setting it aside, not drinking it, not even looking at it, just removing it from the space like it no longer belonged there. And that small, controlled action said more than anything else, because it showed me exactly how he operated, removing variables, adjusting the environment, controlling what could be controlled. "You are not going back out there," he said. And this time it was not a suggestion, not even a command, it was a decision already made, and I felt the weight of it settle over me immediately. "I have a job," I replied, the words sounding smaller than I intended, because suddenly that job felt like something distant, something irrelevant compared to what was unfolding here. "Not tonight," he said, and there was no room left in his voice for argument, no space for negotiation, just a quiet finality that made it clear this was no longer about what I wanted or what I planned. It was about what had already been set into motion and the role I now played in it, whether I understood it fully or not. And as I stood there, in a room I had never meant to enter, facing a man I had never meant to confront, I realized with a clarity that settled deep in my chest that leaving had never really been an option, not from the moment I slipped that note into his hand, not from the moment he chose to read it, and definitely not now. The finality in his voice did not echo, but it settled into me with a quiet permanence that made it impossible to ignore, like a door closing somewhere I could not see but knew I could not reopen. And for a moment I just stood there, feeling the weight of it, the shift from something temporary to something that had direction, intention, consequence. I should have argued, should have pushed back harder, should have insisted on leaving while there was still something resembling choice. But the truth was I understood what he was saying in a way that made resistance feel hollow, because this was no longer about preference or control, it was about timing, about patterns that had already been set in motion long before I stepped into them. "Then what?" I asked, and this time there was no hesitation, no attempt to soften the question, because if I was staying, if this was already moving forward without my consent, then I needed to understand the shape of it, needed to know where it was going to take me. Adrian's gaze held mine for a second longer, and there was something different in it now, not suspicion, not calculation, something closer to decision, like he had reached a point where observation was no longer enough and action was required. "Then you come with me," he said, and the simplicity of it made it heavier, because there was no explanation attached, no justification, just a statement of what would happen next. I felt the shift in my chest immediately, not panic, not fear, but something sharper, something that recognized the line I was being asked to cross. "I am not going anywhere with you," I replied, and this time the resistance came naturally, not forced, not calculated, just instinctive, because whatever this was, wherever it led, I understood enough to know it would not bring me back to anything familiar. For the first time since this began, he did not respond immediately, and that pause stretched just long enough to register as consideration rather than dismissal, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but more direct than anything before. "You are already involved," he said. "Whether you move or not does not change that." And there was something undeniable in that, something that cut through the instinct to refuse, because it was true in a way I could not argue against. I turned slightly, glancing toward the door, toward the corridor beyond it, toward the ballroom I could no longer hear but still felt connected to in some distant way, and for a second I imagined walking back out, blending into the crowd, finishing my shift like nothing had happened, but the image did not hold. It dissolved the moment I tried to place myself in it, because I knew it would not work, knew I would not make it 10 steps without being seen, without being recognized as something that did not belong anymore. "Where?" I asked instead, the word coming out softer than I intended, not because I was agreeing, but because I was acknowledging the reality I could no longer ignore. Adrian did not answer with a location, did not offer details, just a slight movement of his hand toward the door, a gesture that carried the same quiet certainty as everything else he had done tonight. "Somewhere you are not expected," he said, and there was something in that phrasing that stayed with me, not safe, not secure, just not expected, like unpredictability itself was the protection. I let out a slow breath, feeling the last traces of resistance settle into something else, something more controlled, more deliberate, because if I was going to step into this, if I was already part of it whether I wanted to be or not, then I needed to do it with awareness, not reaction. "And if I say no?" I asked, and this time I held his gaze fully, Not challenging, not defiant, just clear, because I needed to hear it, needed to understand exactly where the boundary was, if there even was one. He studied me for a second, and then, without shifting his tone, without adding emphasis, he answered in a way that felt more honest than anything else he had said. Then you walk out that door, he said, and you take your chances with people who now have a reason to look for you. And there was no threat in it, no pressure, just a statement of fact, and that made it more real than anything else, because it left the choice exactly where it was, with me, but stripped it of any illusion that one option was safe and the other was not. I looked at the door again, at the handle that would lead me back into a world that now felt distant, and then back at him, at the man who had become the center of something I had never intended to enter, and for a second everything was still, balanced on a decision I could not undo once made, and then I nodded, not because I trusted him, not because I wanted this, but because I understood the reality of what came next, and as I moved toward the door, stepping into a path I had not chosen but could no longer avoid, I realized that whatever this night had started, it was not ending here, it was only changing direction. The moment I stepped toward the door, something inside me shifted, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else could see, but enough that I felt it, like crossing an invisible line I could not step back over, and when my hand reached for the handle I hesitated for just a fraction of a second, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that whatever waited on the other side was no longer separate from me. The door opened smoothly, almost too easily, and the corridor beyond felt different now, not just quieter, but altered, like the space itself had adjusted in the time we had been inside, and I became aware of it immediately, the absence of movement where there should have been staff, the subtle stillness that replaced the low hum of activity, and I did not need Adrian to confirm it for me, I could feel it in the way my instincts sharpened without warning. He stepped out behind me, not rushing, not scanning, just moving with the same controlled certainty that had defined him all night, and that contrast made everything else feel sharper, because where I felt the shift, he expected it. "Stay close," he said, his voice low, not urgent, just precise, and this time I did not question it, did not resist, because the hallway no longer felt like a neutral space, it felt like something in transition, something that had already been altered in ways I could not fully see. We moved down the corridor, past doors that remained closed, past corners that seemed too still, and with each step I became more aware of the absence of normalcy, the lack of staff moving between rooms, the lack of sound from the ballroom we had just left, and it was not until we reached the intersection near the service entrance that I understood why. One of his men stood there, positioned in a way that did not block the path but controlled it. His posture relaxed but intentional, and when Adrian approached, he gave a slight nod, stepping aside without a word, and that small interaction confirmed everything I had been sensing. This was not coincidence, this was adjustment, a response already in motion. "The back exit is clear," the man said quietly, and I caught the words this time, clear enough to understand, and something in my chest tightened again. Not fear, but awareness, because clear did not mean safe, it meant managed. Adrian did not respond verbally, just a brief glance that carried more meaning than any instruction, and then he continued forward, expecting me to follow, and I did, because at this point following him was not about trust, it was about alignment with the only direction that made sense. The service exit door was heavier than the others, metal instead of wood, industrial instead of polished, and when it opened, the air changed immediately, cooler, sharper, carrying the distant sound of traffic and the faint hum of the city beyond the building, and for a second it felt like stepping into a different world entirely. The alley outside was dimly lit, the kind of space most people never noticed, tucked behind something larger, something more important, and yet it felt more real than the ballroom we had just left, more honest in its simplicity. A black SUV idled near the curb, engine running, headlights off, and I recognized the setup instantly, not because I had seen it before, but because it fit too perfectly into everything else that had unfolded tonight. Adrian moved toward it without hesitation, and when he reached the door, he opened it, not for himself, but for me, a gesture that should have felt polite, but instead carried the same controlled expectation as everything else he had done. I paused for a second, just long enough to feel the weight of the choice again, because even now, even here, there was still a moment where I could turn, could walk in the opposite direction, could test whatever he had said about taking my chances, but the thought did not hold, it broke apart under the weight of everything I now understood. Stepped forward instead, sliding into the seat, the interior quiet, insulated, and the moment I did, the door closed behind me with a soft, final sound that felt louder than it should have, and as Adrian moved around to the other side, taking his place beside me without a word, I realized that whatever distance had existed between my world and his had just been erased completely, not gradually, not carefully, but all at once, in a single decision I could not take back. The door closed with a soft click that felt louder than it should have, sealing in the quiet, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the engine humming beneath us like a steady pulse that anchored everything else in place. And I became aware of the space in a way I had not expected, the leather seats, the faint scent of something clean and expensive, the muted city noise filtered through tinted glass, and it struck me how different this felt from the chaos I had just stepped out of. Not safer, not calmer, just controlled in a way that made everything inside it feel deliberate. The driver did not turn, did not ask for direction, and as soon as Adrian settled beside me, the vehicle began to move, smooth, precise, like it had been waiting for this exact moment, and I felt the shift immediately, the subtle pull as we merged into the city, leaving the alley, the ballroom, everything familiar behind without a single glance back. I kept my hands in my lap, still steady, though I could feel the tension beneath the surface, the awareness that every second was carrying me further from something I understood and deeper into something I did not. And for the first time since this began, the quiet gave space for questions that had been held back by urgency. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice even controlled, because if I was going to stay in this, if I was going to move forward without resisting every step, then I needed something, even if it was just a direction. Adrian did not answer immediately, and I turned slightly to look at him, watching the way he sat, relaxed but not casual. His posture composed in a way that suggested nothing about this was unexpected. Nothing about this required adjustment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was as steady as everything else about him. "Away from where you were seen," he said, and the answer was simple, but it carried more weight than any location could have, because it confirmed what I had already begun to understand, that this was not about where we were going, it was about what we were leaving behind. I looked out the window then, watching the city move past in blurred reflections, streetlights stretching across the glass, people on sidewalks who had no idea how close they were to something they would never see, and the normalcy of it all felt strange, disconnected from everything that had just happened, like I had stepped out of one version of the city and into another without crossing any visible line. "You said they would start with proximity," I said after a moment, turning back to him. "So they will look at everyone who was close." And I knew I was stating the obvious, but I needed to hear it confirmed, needed to understand how I fit into that pattern. "They will narrow it," he replied, his tone calm, measured. "They will remove what does not matter until only what does remains." And there was something familiar in the way he said it, something that echoed his earlier words, and I realized with a quiet certainty that he was describing not just what they would do, but what he had already done with me. "And I matter?" I said, not as a question, but as a realization I could no longer avoid, and this time he looked at me directly, his gaze steady, unreadable, but there was something in it that felt like acknowledgement rather than evaluation. "You changed the outcome," he said again, and the repetition carried weight, not because it was new, but because it was being reinforced, anchored into something I could not ignore. I let out a slow breath, leaning back slightly, not relaxing, but adjusting to the space, to the reality of where I was, and for a moment I closed my eyes, just long enough to gather my thoughts, to push past the instinct to react and settle into something more controlled, more deliberate. "You knew before?" I said quietly, opening my eyes again, focusing on him. "When you said I had been watching you," and I paused, letting the words settle, because this was the part that had not made sense, the part that had lingered beneath everything else. "You were not guessing." And this time he did not deflect, did not redirect, he just held my gaze for a second longer before giving a slight nod, almost imperceptible, but enough. "No," he said, and the simplicity of it confirmed more than anything else could have, because it meant this was not just a reaction to tonight, it was part of something that had been building long before it began. I felt the weight of that settle into me, heavier than before, because it meant I had not just stepped into his world tonight, I had been moving toward it without realizing, and the distance between those two truths was smaller than I had ever allowed myself to consider. The city lights continued to pass outside, steady, indifferent, and as the vehicle moved forward without hesitation, without pause, I understood with a clarity that settled deep in my chest that this was not just about what had happened at the gala, it was about everything that had led up to it, everything I had tried to keep separate, and the realization that maybe, just maybe, That separation had never really existed at all. The city kept moving, indifferent and steady, but inside the car something had shifted in a way I could not ignore. Like a thread I had been holding loosely was suddenly pulled tight, connecting moments I had tried to keep separate into something continuous, something unavoidable, and I felt it in the quiet space between us, in the absence of unnecessary words, in the way Adrian no longer watched me like a question waiting to be answered, but like something already placed within a larger pattern. "You let it happen?" I said after a moment, the realization forming fully as the words left my mouth. Not an accusation, not yet, but a statement I needed to test against him, because it was the only way to make sense of everything that had unfolded. The way he had reacted, the way he had already known too much. He did not respond immediately, but this time the silence felt different, not evaluative, not searching, just deliberate, like he was deciding how much of the truth I could handle now that I had stepped this far into it. "I allowed the possibility," he said finally, and the distinction mattered. I could hear it in the way he said it, controlled, precise, like every word had been chosen long before this conversation began, and that only made the weight of it heavier, because it meant nothing about tonight had been entirely unpredictable to him. I let that settle for a second, the implication of it spreading through everything else, reshaping it, because if he had allowed it, then the failure of the plan was not just an accident, it was a deviation, something that had been altered, and I already knew who had altered it. "Because you were waiting?" I said quietly, the pieces aligning faster now. "You knew someone would try something?" And I turned slightly toward him, needing to see his reaction, needing to confirm what I was beginning to understand. His gaze met mine, steady, unchanged, but there was something there now that had not been before. Not surprise, not even acknowledgement, something closer to acceptance. Like I had reached a point he had expected eventually. "I knew there was movement," he said. "I did not know the method." And that answer carried more weight than anything else, because it meant he had been preparing for something without knowing exactly what it would be, and tonight had given him that answer in a way he had not planned. "So I was not part of your plan," I said, and the realization felt sharper than I expected, because it meant I had not just interfered. I had introduced something entirely new into a situation that had already been unfolding. "No," he replied simply, and there was no hesitation in it, no attempt to soften the truth, just clarity. "You were not." I leaned back slightly, letting the leather seat support me as I processed that, because it meant everything I had done tonight existed outside his control, outside his expectations, and yet here I was, sitting beside him, moving deeper into his world instead of away from it. "Then why keep me close?" I asked, and this time the question came from a different place, not confusion, not fear, but something more deliberate, because if I was not part of his plan, then my presence now was a choice, not a necessity, and I needed to understand that choice. He did not look away, did not shift his posture, just answered with the same calm certainty that had defined everything else. "Because you changed the direction," he said, and the words landed differently now, not as an observation but as a conclusion, and I need to understand how. And there it was, the truth laid out in a way that left no room for misinterpretation, because this was not about protecting me, not entirely, not even primarily, this was about information, about understanding the variable that had altered something he had been watching closely. I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because I understood, because it aligned with everything I had seen in him, the way he observed, the way he removed what did not fit, the way he controlled what he could and studied what he could not. And for the first time since this began, I felt something settle into place inside me, not comfort, not acceptance, but clarity, the kind that comes when you stop trying to fit something into what you want it to be and start seeing it for what it actually is. I turned my gaze back to the window, watching the city continue past in blurred lines of light and shadow, and for a moment I let myself sit in that clarity, in the understanding that whatever this had started as, whatever I had thought I was doing when I slipped that note into his hand, it had already become something else entirely, something neither of us had planned but both of us were now part of, and as the car moved forward without slowing, without hesitation, I realized that the real question was no longer why this had happened, but what it was going to become now that it had. The car slowed gradually, not abruptly, just enough that I could feel the shift beneath me, the steady motion easing into something more controlled, more intentional, and when I looked outside, the city had changed again, not the bright, crowded streets of Manhattan, but something quieter, narrower, a stretch of Brooklyn where the buildings stood closer together and the lights felt softer, less performative, more real, And for a moment I just watched it, letting the change settle in because it matched something inside me, something that had shifted without asking for permission. The vehicle came to a stop in front of a building that did not stand out, no sign, no visible security, just a clean exterior and dark windows that reflected the streetlights in a way that revealed nothing about what was inside. And before I could ask, before I could form the next question that had been building in my mind, the engine cut off and the silence returned, thicker now, more complete. Adrian did not move immediately, and neither did I, and in that stillness I became aware of the distance we had traveled, not just in miles but in everything else, in the way the night had unfolded, in the way I was no longer the same person who had stepped into that ballroom with a tray in my hands and a decision I thought I could walk away from. "This is where you stay for now," he said finally, his voice calm, unchanged. But there was something in it that felt less like instruction and more like acknowledgement, like he understood the weight of what he was saying even if he did not soften it. I turned to him slightly, studying his expression, searching for something more than the controlled certainty he had shown all night. But it was the same, steady, unreadable, and yet I realized I no longer needed it to change, because I understood it now in a way I had not before. "For now," I repeated quietly, and the words felt different this time. Not temporary, not uncertain, just open, like a space that had not yet been defined. He gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to confirm it, enough to tell me that whatever came next was not something either of us could fully predict. I reached for the door handle, pausing for a fraction of a second, not because I was hesitating, but because I felt the moment settle, the quiet recognition that stepping out of this car was not a return to anything familiar. It was a continuation of something that had already begun. When I opened the door, the air outside felt cooler, sharper, carrying the distant sound of the city without the noise, and I stepped out, my shoes touching pavement that felt more real than anything inside the ballroom had. More grounded, more honest, and for the first time since this started, I felt something steady inside me. Not comfort, not certainty, but clarity. Adrian stepped out on the other side, moving around the vehicle with the same controlled precision, and when he reached me, he stopped, not too close, not distant, just present, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence between us no longer heavy, no longer tense, just there, like something that did not need to be filled. "You can leave when this is over," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried a weight that lingered because they acknowledged something neither of us had said out loud, that this was not permanent, not ownership, not control, just a point in time where our paths had crossed and continued together for reasons that still needed to be understood. I met his gaze, holding it without hesitation, because whatever uncertainty had existed before had settled into something else, something more balanced, more aware. "And if I do not want to leave," I said, the question coming from a place I had not expected, not fear, not obligation, but curiosity, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression, subtle, almost invisible, but there, a fraction of something that was not calculation, not control, something closer to recognition. He did not answer immediately, and in that pause I understood that some questions were not meant to be answered right away, not because there was no answer, but because the answer had not fully formed yet. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet, steady, but different in a way I could not fully define. "Then you stay," he said, and the simplicity of it carried more meaning than anything else, because it was not a command, not a decision made for me, it was an acknowledgement of choice, of something that existed outside his control and mine. I nodded once, not agreeing, not refusing, just accepting the moment for what it was, and as I turned toward the building, stepping forward into something unknown but no longer unwelcome, I realized that this had never been about a single choice, a single moment, or a single night. It had been about what happens when two paths that were never meant to cross do anyway, and instead of breaking apart, they change direction together, creating something neither one could have become alone.